welcome to the Off the Charts Football Podcast. I'm Matt Manocherian of Sports Info Solutions, joined by Aaron Schatz of Football Outsiders. As always, we've got our producer, Justin Stein, with us, and today we are joined by the winner of the SIS Football Analytics competition, none other than Emmett Kiernan. But before we get to Emmett, Aaron, it's been a while since we caught up. We are in opt-out season, huh?
Yeah, I guess by the time that the podcast is up and ready for people to listen to, I believe the opt-out deadline will have passed. So we will have found out if there were any surprise Thursday opt-outs. But yeah, obviously there have been some major players who aren't going to play this year. CJ Mosley, Dante Hightower, Laurent Duvernay-Tardif.
The Patriots had their list of players.
Tre'Davious White, by the time you hear this, may have opted out. I guess he's still on the fence and was waiting till the last day to decide. Thanks a lot, Tre'Davious. But Star Lotulelei already opted out. So Buffalo did lose somebody. Everybody from the AFC East except Miami lost somebody major. I guess Miami did too. Albert Wilson and Alan
Hearns. You guys can add those two up. That's like one meaningful player.
Right. That's about as, the equal of like Lotulelei and maybe Patrick Chung. I mean, obviously the Patriots have had more players opt out than any other team. So I'm busy doing a new set of projections for an ESPN articles about which teams are most likely to go first to worst and worst to first. And I decided I had to redo my simulation because so many players have opted out. Between that and the Jamal Adams trade, it changes where teams are. So Kansas City down a little bit, New England down, Buffalo down, Minnesota down a little bit, Seattle up, Jets down a lot. Between losing Adams and losing Mosley, Jets down a lot.
Yeah, definitely two of their best players. I've been keeping an eye, and it sounds to me like at least the hotel sort of mini bubbles that are being set up in places like New Orleans and Tampa Bay sound like a good idea. Maybe give those teams a little bit of a better chance of making it through. Well, yeah, we're all just holding out hope. And Emmett, I guess that's a good time to welcome you on. Thank you for not opting out today. For anybody who doesn't know, Emmett won the SIS Analytics Challenge. He is a recent graduate with a master's in economics from Northeastern University. And he was also a 2019 Kaggle NFL Big Data Bowl 97th percentile finisher. And you wouldn't know from looking at him, but he's a former defensive lineman. So, Emmett, what's up? And welcome to the show.
Hey, Matt, how's it going? Thanks for having me again. And yeah, I lost some weight since my defensive line days. But as I've said, didn't have too much of a college career, so there's not really much to get into there.
Were you on one of those like Joe Thomas diets? Did you go through a whole transformation?
Honestly, it was more, I was always a skinny kid, like basketball player growing up, so did a lot of running around, and it was more hard to put on the weight. So putting on the weight to play college football was the difficult part, and then losing it was just kind of going back to my normal life. So I had to spend so many hours in the weight room and cafeteria to put on the weight in the first place that losing it wasn't nearly as difficult as putting it on for me, but that's a good problem to have, I guess.
Yeah, better for life, even if it's not better for football necessarily. But that's a good kind of transition. So before we start to kind of grill you about competing in the challenge and your results and different things like that, what is your background like? Where are you from originally? And how'd you get into both economics and coding and then football?
Yeah, so originally I'm from Keene, New Hampshire, and there wasn't too many, I guess, analytics types jobs in Keene, New Hampshire, so I didn't see too much of that growing up. I didn't really know anyone who built models for a living or did a lot of coding, which is maybe someone from close to a city maybe would have had those people in their lives growing up. So I didn't really know what I wanted to do quite yet, besides play sports at a young age. So I went into college undecided on a major, and then ended up going with economics just because the classes were interesting to me and seemed like a diverse field. So there was a lot of different things you could do with it. And after I got hurt midway through college, I realized that I should probably start looking a little bit more toward my after college plans, and started applying to a bunch of internships, and really wasn't getting the responses that I was hoping for, just without much of my resume on the time. I mean, I had no GPA, but it wasn't anything crazy, and I didn't have too much internship experience being 19, 20 years old. So I realized that grad school might be the best option for me at that point, just to learn some more skills, pad the resume a little bit. So started learning some higher level math just to prepare for grad school and everything that would come with that. And originally I wasn't necessarily thinking, I mean, I always really enjoyed sports stats, but I didn't really know if I'd do anything involving math for a career. So kind of more just started prepping up on the math to prepare for grad school. And then once I got more into that, kind of the next step I realized was coding. And again, I didn't learn to code necessarily thinking I'd be doing it for a job. It was more, okay, this will be good to help out with certain things. And then started to learn to code and then realized that all these jobs kind of wanted coding skills. So really ramped up on coding in grad school. And then after I finished at Northeastern, I ended up doing a data science boot camp this past spring in New York City. I got like free tuition for that. So I figured there wasn't really too much cost besides opportunity cost to not do that. So I spent some more time practicing Python and learning some more machine learning skills this spring doing that as I finished up my degree and finished up everything. And then that's kind of just where we are now. But I've been working on sports analytics projects for a few years now and really doing more coding. It's really helped me learn to be a better coder because everything that you would be doing during the day in class, I end up doing also in my free time just in sports. And coding in sports helps coding in real life and vice versa, coding in classes and having to think in different kinds of problems, I guess.
It's funny because I hear you talking about opportunity costs. So you're clearly an economist in the way that you like to think about things. But I'm curious to hear more about actually not what you did in school, but that data boot camp that you said you did. I'm curious about that because that seems like something that for somebody that is kind of looking to follow in your footsteps, if there's somebody that's maybe undergrad now or trying to figure out how to get their skills, what's that experience like? And you said you learned Python there mostly?
Yeah, I knew some Python beforehand, but we worked exclusively in Python at the boot camp. I mean, and some stuff like SQL and Unix and that stuff too. But Python was the main where you'd be doing the actual models and stuff. And for me, it was a great experience. I think a lot of it was also that I'd done a decent amount of coding, but a lot of the coding that I'd done was either for class or on sports projects of my own. So if I were, I guess, to be looking forward to the future, I'd be thinking, okay, on job applications, at that point, they'd basically just have to like take my word for it that I was a good coder. Unless, I mean, a lot of jobs will send you challenges and stuff, but you usually have to get to a certain point on that. So for me, the main reason was originally, okay, I think I need something for the resume that will say, okay, yes, I clearly did a lot of coding, not just, oh, I have done a lot of sports projects and maybe, I mean, a lot of places you can, I guess, give examples, but for me, I was mostly thinking, I guess I just needed something a little bit more concrete. And I wasn't 100% sure before, I guess, how much I would learn from it because I've always been a great online learner. And for me, I learn a lot on YouTube and just going back to college and when I was even younger, I've always kind of learned more on my own than I ever did in a classroom. So at the time, anything I learned, I guess for me would be a little bit more of a bonus over what I would have learned on my own. Like I said, opportunity costs just on the internet, but it ended up being a great experience. The instructors were really talented and knew a lot, and not having to pay for it, I guess, really helped the experience for me. I'd maybe view it a little differently if I'd had to put a decent amount of money into that. But for me, overall, it was nothing but a positive experience. And I mean, going forward, I'm not sure how much in-person instruction there'll be from stuff like that with COVID and everything. But I think that for someone, if you didn't do a computer science major, a data science major in college, it can be a good opportunity to kind of, in just a 3-month span, get a lot of the skills that some people go to school for 1 to 2 years for.
All right, let's transition forward and let's start to talk about the challenge and your submission. So first, how'd you learn about the Sports Info Solutions Analytics Challenge?
I honestly don't 100% remember where I saw that, but when I did see it, I thought, okay, this looks interesting.
sounds like you're doing that on your free time anyway. It's interesting that you bring that up too, about how self-taught you are. And a lot of times the people that get really good at this sort of stuff are people that can kind of just go off on their own and dive into it. You learn by doing a lot of the time. Okay, so you heard about it, you got all about it, and you took this angle kind of here. I would kind of describe your presentation as a 3-part process, where first you figure out how you were going to divide out the players, right? The question was, what's the most valuable defensive line position? You took a really interesting strategy towards figuring out how you were going to divide out each of the position groups. Then from there, just from a high level, you did some mixed modeling approaches, which gave you the ideas about how valuable different players were for whichever position they were playing. And then from there, you did what you called, I think, your ROI analysis, which started to look into, based on that quantification that you did in kind of step 2, how much bang for the buck do you get for the various positions. So with that being the general angle, my first question for you was, what led you to pursue that angle? When you looked at the problem, how did you wrap your head around it and get to the point where you figured out that that's how you wanted to attack it?
With the clustering point that originally you brought up, I think the SIS data was just so valuable for that, seeing all the position alignments, because front 7 is so unique how the labels don't tell you all that much about what the player did, because you could have an inside linebacker, off-ball linebacker so different than a pass rusher. And like I said, a nose tackle like Vita Villa is so much different than a DeForest Buckner, or a 3-4 defensive end like Cameron Hayward is so different than a pass rusher D-end who maybe even plays linebacker at this point, but is listed as D-end because that's what he was drafted as. So originally, a few months ago before this challenge, I had just been doing some personal work trying to measure something similar, which was position value and ROI and all that. And I found it really frustrating how I couldn't really measure these positions against each other from the roster labels without bringing in a lot of arbitrary analysis, or just maybe even just calling front seven in general, or trying to split everything up. It was just so hard and so frustrating because there's no real good labels to define how these players play. So all of a sudden we had this alignment data, which told us exactly where they lined up. And that really just made the problem so much easier. So for me, I thought clustering into 3 was made the most sense, because I didn't want to do too many, because at that point you're overfitting a little bit and maybe not comparing players who should be comparing. So you're lowering the sample size. And I didn't want to do 2 because, as I've explained in the presentation here, I think, nose, I call it tackle. Tackle's the one where the word I don't really like, because tackle means a lot of things, but for lack of a better term, I use tackle as the 3-4 end, 3 technique, some 5 technique type player, and then where they're playing the run and doing some pass rushing, and then edge is really there to get after the passer. And that seemed like the most intuitive way to break it into 3 categories. And yeah, like I said, calling that middle category tackle runs into a lot of overlap with terms, I guess, but I don't really have a better option at the moment.
Under tackle maybe, but not all of those guys are playing in under setups. So yeah.
Yeah, I thought about calling them inside, middle, outside, but even middle or all that could be used as overlapping again. So for now, we'll just stick with edge, nose, tackle, and realize that tackle could get confusing, I guess.
Well, I thought it was really great because as you displayed the kind of allotments of how the guys got distributed in all the positions, you can see really quickly that there are a lot of guys that would fit into either nose or tackle that spend a lot of time lined up at 3 technique. But you can see the split for the rest of the time is some of those guys are 3 technique to 5 techniques, and some of those guys are 3 techniques who are mostly in a 1, a 0, a 2-eye, something like that. So in any other way that you would have split out these position types, a 3 technique would have just been a 3 technique. And I think that does a really great job of understanding the difference. And as you show, like the player examples of that between somebody like DeForest Buckner versus Javon Hargrave. There's clearly a difference there in what those players are doing from somebody like you who played defensive line. So I thought that was a really nice way to kind of break things out.
Yeah, thank you. I thought so too. And I think that I know in the league there's some questions over the franchise tag where linebackers want to be DNs and stuff like that. And I mean, I've seen on the offensive side of the ball too, with tight ends wanting to be receivers. But I wonder what the NFL's solution going forward will be for that, because there's a couple $1 million at stake for someone being labeled a linebacker versus a D end. And
yeah, it's not just Jimmy Graham trying to get labeled as a receiver. It's understanding this is really interesting. Unfortunately, they don't use anything like this to define that. And you get the crazy Pro Bowl scheme that they came out with last year where you had like 7 defensive backs.
They always, because the Pro Bowl picks linebackers and defensive ends, they always pick outside linebackers from 3-4 positions who have big sack stats, and you end up with just nothing but pass rushers in a game where you have rules against blitzing.
Yeah, not the best system. It would be interesting for both, like for salary reasons, like you're talking about, setting the franchise tag, but then also for things like Pro Bowl, All Pro, having something like this to define what position somebody is, make them just eligible as that, and then you can vote amongst them in one position as opposed to having your Khalil Mack be on a defensive end and an outside linebacker at the same time.
Yeah, I mean, like I said, there's always going to be a borderline when it's an arbitrary definition. Like, even splitting into 3 categories, like there'll be someone who's closest to the border, but I think that's a lot better than the current system, which you have players being called linebackers who do completely different things, and that's not quite as similar as a different approach could be.
I want to get into that kind of middle part of what you did. You used a mixed effects model to evaluate pass rush ability. So essentially what you're doing there is taking some fixed effects and some random effects, and by setting the fixed effects, I think you used down distance and technique. You were able to compare the different positions against each other for value. What led you to use that mixed effects model approach?
Mostly just the opportunity to get a player intercept. So it considers the impact of down distance technique. So it basically says what you would expect the impact from technique, down distance, and all that. And on top of realizing that the players perform differently. So it kind of adjusts for the context there and really brings us at an individual level. But mostly, like I said in the presentation, the partial pooling is really nice, because if you're just looking at pressure rate, a guy with 40 pass blitz snaps has a lot more chance for variance, whether it's high or low, than someone with 150 or whatever. So the mixed effects model, the approach that they call partial pooling, kind of punishes for a smaller sample and regresses to the mean a bit. So a lower number of snaps, it won't, I guess, stand out as quite so much of like an outlier. So otherwise, even, and I didn't want to come up with arbitrary cutoff points necessarily either, as much as I could avoid. So if we're saying, okay, only 100 snaps or 50 snaps, we'd have to cut it off somewhere if we're just looking at, say, pass rush rate. So, and it's kind of just hard to interpret, okay, so what would 8% pressures at 60 snaps, how does that compare to 7% pressures at 120 snaps? So kind of let the model do that for us naturally a little bit. And I mean, it's definitely not perfect. Another option would be kind of setting up a model, whether it's Bayesian or something else, to kind of punish it on our own. So maybe it would be, okay, if we're looking at how long it takes for this stat to stabilize over time. So if we had more data on that, we could look at, okay, of players of their first 50 pass rush snaps, how does that compare to their future numbers versus their first 75 snaps? So we could kind of use the empirical data to come up with how we'd punish them / regress to the mean by just looking at how long it takes the stat to stabilize.
You probably need more than half a season of sample size to do something.
Yeah,
like
exactly. And there's also a lot of factors which I didn't control for, especially with such a smaller sample, like home field advantage would be one. Obviously, player personnel. Like I said in the presentation, the right tackle side had more pressures, but that didn't hold up overall teams, because the team struggled at left tackle, then maybe left tackle was more vulnerable for that one game. So I didn't adjust for side yet, because I wanted to adjust. If in the future I went into more depth, I'd want to adjust based on the team. So just saying, okay, right tackle had X% more pressures doesn't necessarily tell the full story if we're adjusting for the side there. So, and a naive model, you could have brought offensive team as a control variable or technique over offensive team. So, but that would also not tell us the full story without player snaps. So if a team had a great left tackle for the first 5-6 weeks and it was really hard to get pressures against that left tackle, and then all of a sudden that player got hurt, either it was just a half, a full game,
right,
and a backup came in and the defensive end did really well against that backup, then they'd be getting too much credit because the model would say, oh, this team was hard to rush on the left tackle side, and this guy rushed really well against the left tackle side without realizing it was a different left tackle. So without having offensive lineman snap data, I didn't really want to overfit there.
Right, and that makes sense. I'm sure we would have seen if we had given that offensive participation data a whole bunch of sort of adjusted plus minus looking stuff, but built around sort of the offensive and defensive line positions.
Yeah, I think going forward that would be definitely the first adjustment I'd make with more data and potentially offensive data. But overall, I think that the model does a pretty good job for being naive. And I think understanding the limitations is important because as that was one of the things with the run defense metrics, I didn't necessarily want to fit like an EPA added or an omniscient metric that I thought would be a little deceiving if we're saying, okay, this player was the best run defender, because there's a lot of limitations with individual run defense statistics. So I think understanding the limitations and knowing how to either adjust for them going forward or regress to a market or something else like a PFF grade where you could use kind of as a baseline and maybe not take a model as 100% for its word if you understand the limitations and kind of know, one, what can be fixed going forward, and two, how much are we regressing to a market if it's betting terms or a baseline grade, whether it's PFF or something else.
Right, and we saw that. We didn't see PFF grades in other assignments, but we did see Madden grades. We saw people use kind of Vegas odds. Those are all, I think, reasonable ways to approach it. I think no matter what, if you use something like that, you're going to end up kind of being subject to whatever biases that might have associated with it inherently. But I'm with you in kind of what you're saying about understanding what these results are saying and what they aren't saying. And so on that, what did you find? What, in terms of return on investment, you had the single pressure model to kind of describe the passing game impact. You said you had those three models basically that you used kind of mixed together for the running game, so that you wouldn't be too biased in any one direction, like you were just talking about. At the end of the day, when you saw all the results and everything that came out, you decided to look at it in terms of how well teams are spending their money. What did you learn there?
Yeah, I learned that edge and tackle in the pass rush game appear to have very similar returns on investment. But I guess the catch would be why I find edge more important is, one, they pressure at a higher rate. Two, they get a higher percentage of pass rush snaps. And three, when an edge gets a pressure or a pressure from an edge technique, it has more negative impact on the offense than when it's coming from the middle, which is, I mean, like I said, we just have an 8-week sample there, so it's possible more data could change that finding. But the return on investment side, edge and tackle appear to be very similar, and for pass rushing. And then nose has some negative correlation, actually, which to me made sense because a nose tackle isn't necessarily in there to get pressure, so they're there to be a run stopper. So maybe the noses who are drafted higher or got a bigger salary, they do the run so well that that's just what they're in there for.
I don't think it's anybody's going to argue with you that nose tackles are probably not the most important for pass
rushing. Yeah,
pass rushing. So you say that they're equal in terms of return on investment, but edges are also paid more than tackles are in general. So that return on investment is equal within the framework of edge being more valuable. They're just kind of paid appropriately, is what you would say?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, paid appropriately is there'd be a lot of analysis that would have to go into that for me to, I guess, determine, because quarterback would be the most important thing, would be figuring out what percentage of the salary cap should be devoted to quarterback. So just because I think quarterback is so much more important than other positions. So, I mean, I haven't done any deep research into that. I could see myself coming away with the take that quarterbacks are underpaid compared to everything else, perhaps, and maybe teams should bump that salary down. But like I said, I haven't done any research into that yet, so I don't.
Relative to one another, they're paid.
Yeah, relative to edge and tackle, relative to each other, the market appears to be at least efficient. If we're just comparing those two, the return on investment is quite similar with pass rush.
In your pass rush model, I point out to people that one of the things about it is that the correlation between the sort of player value and how much they get paid or how much draft value is used on them is, about 0.3 for edge and tackle, and it's actually negative for nose. On the graphic for edge, there is one player who is a very clear outlier with a terrible, terrible performance, but his standardized value is like 3 standard deviations above the mean.
Yeah, I can interrupt you because I think I know who that is. I think we're talking about Solomon Thomas, who was the third overall pick and did not perform very well.
It's interesting also because Solomon Thomas last year did play some of what I think would be considered a tackle position, but your sorting came out with him as more of an edge. So he played more of the edge position than he did the tackle position. Yeah,
I was surprised by that too. I looked up his splits and he was playing on the outside a lot, which I think, like I said, there's a border everywhere, and he was probably one of those guys who was close to the border. But I did look at him in particular and looked up his exact splits just because I wanted to make sure I wasn't missing something there.
Yeah, he
did play on the edge a little bit.
If you had counted him as a tackle, he would have been less of an outlier, but he still would have been an outlier. So let this be a lesson that you can have a really bad draft pick and still have a really good pass rush, because San Francisco rode its defense last year and they blew that draft pick badly.
Yeah, luckily for them, they tripled down on front 7 high draft picks and hit on 2 of the 3, but
3 of the 3 actually. If you think about Buckner, Armstead, and then Bosa, 3 of the 4.
Oh, Bosa too. Yeah, I guess they quadrupled down, so they hit on 3 of the 4 then. But yeah, that is pretty wild how 4 straight, but 4 out of, was that 4 straight or 4 out of 5 years they took?
Well, I think some of those years they'd have 2 first-round picks though. Washington is listening to the podcast, going, "Let this be us, please."
Yeah, right.
Cool. Anything else, Aaron, you wanted to ask about? I feel like I was hogging some of the mic a little bit earlier. Anything else you wanted to ask Emmett about regarding his model?
No, I think it's really interesting. It came out, you don't want the results of this stuff to always come out with, what you expect. But it sort of agreed with, I think, a lot of the findings of analytics about defensive line positioning, which is that for the most part, nose tackle performance, I believe what I said in the broadcast that we did about the paper was, are you almost kind of saying nose tackles don't matter in the same way that running backs don't matter, which is that they do matter, but they just don't matter as much, because the nose tackle, especially on pass rushing, the fact that nose tackle performance on pass rushing had a negative correlation with how much investment was made on these players. And then in 2 of your 3 run attempts to measure the run, there was basically no correlation, suggests that nose tackle is a place you can go cheap. And it also makes sense, I think, with the fact that historically nose tackles tend to have longer careers. Some of these guys, because, they maybe because of the fact that once you're a professional who knows what you're doing, you're pretty much like all the other professionals who know what they're doing. Guys like Ted Washington and Keith Traylor lasted until their late 30s. Yeah,
like I said, I'm not necessarily sure about the don't matter thing, just because I don't think that we have very great data on individual run defense performance yet. So It's possible that going forward, maybe someone finds something that, but at the very least, at least return on investment, it doesn't appear to be, although we're not necessarily getting into historical data. So it could be a small sample size problem because there's not as many nose tackles in the league. So this didn't include guys like Vince Wilfork, who I think was a first-round pick, we were to go back historically, I don't remember exactly when Ted Washington was drafted. He was a little before
Right.
my
He played in the 90s and early 2000s.
Yeah, I remember Ted Washington. I just don't know his draft pick.
Sam Adams and Pat Williams. And I mean, obviously there were guys who were considered really great nose tackles back then. But I mean, there's guys who are considered really great nose tackles today. Damon Harrison, for example.
Yeah, I mean, Brandon Williams, the Ravens, I think he did well in my model. And
Kenny Clark came out really good.
Yeah, Kenny Clark.
I think like was he your pass rush leader? I believe he was.
Yeah, I think Kenny Clark was the pass rush leader for nose tackle. Yeah, a lot of those guys weren't first-round picks or weren't high draft picks, but I think to understand more, maybe even, although we won't have these metrics on guys like Ted Washington and Pat Williams, but was Pat Williams a first-round pick? I forget. Oh, no, he was undrafted. It's possible that's I guess maybe more evidence toward the replaceability, but
at least anecdotal.
Yeah, at least. Like I said, there's not a ton of people known as, I guess, star nose tackles in the NFL right now. So anything we're dealing with is a pretty small sample, but of what we have right now, it appears that the return on investment, you don't need to spend an early draft pick or a lot of money to get great nose tackle performance.
And just to add a tiny bit of nuance to that, when we're talking about the pass rush model, this where the return on investment wasn't really there. And if we look at football analytics in terms of pass versus run value, pass is going to be much more valuable than run. So that probably has a lot to do with kind of what's going on there. In the run models, especially gap changes forced, nose did show some return on investment there. So.
Yeah, and the other run models, it didn't though, really. It was just in the third model, in the gap changes forced model, it definitely showed some value.
So there wasn't a lot of correlation with return on investment in any of the run models, and they were pretty noisy. So I wasn't necessarily taking the return on investment 100% as anything more than potential noise because, like I said, there's still a lot of flaws with these run defense statistics, and a lot of them showed different correlations than each other. And I think that one problem in data analysis can be kind of cherry picking models and tweaking them until they fit a good narrative. So I didn't necessarily want to tweak the parameters and tweak the inputs until I had 3 models that told similar stories on return on investment or fit a good narrative. So overall, I think I just kind of wanted to attribute the return on investment mostly to noise and say that it doesn't quite tell the full story right now. And I think we could learn more about these metrics by, one, seeing their year-to-year correlation and seeing how well they'd hold year-to-year, 2, comparing them to between different years to something like PFF grades, or 3, just kind of seeing how team performance changes year-to-year. And the plus-minus thing, I think within a season, a player – there's not that much on-off splits. And I think the on-off split plus-minus thing, it can be valuable, but it can also be overfit and finding kind of conclusions that aren't there. But I think it would be interesting to see how a team changes year to year when they lose certain big money players. Another thing, I guess, that could be a proxy for player value would be if a player gets ruled out, kind of seeing how the Vegas odds react to that. So seeing how much they'd react to a star edge missing time versus a star tackle could give us kind of another proxy or prior, because markets incorporate a lot of information and a lot of different sources and kind of balance each other out a little bit. So if all of a sudden a Chandler Jones went down or a Von Miller went down and missed a week, we could kind of see how much the market really...
My guess is the market would not move at all to any nose tackle going out.
Yeah, exactly. Definitely, I don't think a nose tackle we'd notice at all. I'm not sure how much an edge would be. Probably, I don't want to try to put a number on it, but it probably would be less than some people think, because individual defensive players don't change the market very much, if at all. But maybe there's at least a little bit of insight that we could see there, just on a proxy for what a market full of player models feels.
I think what you're bringing about is a real difficult thing, and that is there's no great single source of truth when it comes to evaluating football. It's not like we can go back and we can say, no, objectively, this is how important nose tackle is, and this is the best player at that, and this is how much value it brings. So it gets a little bit circular no matter what you're looking at a certain point. Aaron, did you have any more questions for Emmett?
No, I'm good. Folks should definitely watch for him in the future because this was a pretty cool little thing we did here.
Yep, keep an eye out for Emmett Kiernan, certainly a rising star. And we'll be back next week with more of the typical show. We'll be getting more back into this swing of the season as training camps continue to ramp up. And we hopefully get moving from just working out with each other to actually beginning to practice within the next few weeks.
To not playing preseason games.
To not playing preseason games. They're not even really like running real football for a while still. So we just got to be patient, I guess.
It was a lot of fun. Thanks for putting on the contest and having me on the podcast. It was a really great event, and the fact that the contest was for charity made it even better. So
congratulations again. Thank you to all of our listeners, and be sure to check us out on Twitter at sportsinfo_SIS and at FB Outsiders. We appreciate everybody who donated and who participated in the challenge. And as a reminder, the Football Outsiders Almanac is out. It is hot right now. Get your copy and get all prepped up for the season. Even though things are changing, the vast majority of the information in the Almanac will be evergreen content for sure.
Basically, just read it and go, oh, the Jets are worse than this.
For my co-host, Aaron Schatz, our producer, Justin Stein, and our guest, Emmett Kiernan, I'm Matt Manocherian, and thank you for joining us for the latest episode of the Off the Charts Football Podcast.